As Huddersfield grew, taking in the neighbouring hamlets and villages, so its responsibilities multiplied. There was no national health service, and in particular tuberculosis was rampant at the beginning of the 20th century. Today in the country, the conditions which it breeds are practically non-existent, but in that period poverty, malnutrition and overcrowding in poor, damp housing was commonplace. Treatment for TB around the turn of the century consisted in the main of subjecting the patient to a period of isolation in hospital out in the country where they could breathe relatively free, fresh air free from pollutants. In 1913, the Huddersfield Health Committee considered the environs of Bradley to be sufficiently beneficial in the treatment of TB for a tuberculosis hospital to be sited in the parish. In April 1914, it was resolved the following contracts to be offered work at constructing the Bradley Sanatorium. However, it's not until the following April that instructions were given to commence the necessary preliminary drainage work and start laying down roads, but by June 1915 construction was well underway. As the building continued, so unfortunately the course of the Great War which had broken out in 1914, and by the time of the construction of the Bradley Sanatorium was underway in 1915, times were bad, and the War Office was having difficulty finding suitable accommodation for the wounded soldiers returning from the front line. On Thursday 4th of March 1917, Bradley Sanatorium was given over to the War Office. Indeed, King George V detrained at Bradley Station when visiting Bradley Wood Hospital during the First World War, and it was for that visit that Station Road was first tarmacked. Following the cessation of hostilities and the armistice, Bradley Gate Hospital reverted back to its original role as a sanatorium for the relief of those suffering from tuberculosis, and the signs of war gradually faded. Today, nothing of the sanatorium remains. Well, nothing much except for the preliminary fence which surrounded the site. The site is now covered with prestigious housing estate. Even the wooden lodge house is gone, replaced by a modern dwelling. Nor indeed does anything survive of the Bradley Lane nursing home which once existed. Bradley saw rather more activity during the Second World War of 1939 to 1945 than the previous. Up Bradley Road a military camp was constructed on the fields next to the farmstead of Breer Hill. Here 25 wooden huts were erected and a battery of anti-aircraft guns was set up to help protect the town of Huddersfield. A small number of guns were also strategically placed around the district, and L.B. Holiday's chemical works was protected in such a manner, and a gun placement along the embankment of the railway viaduct survived as a relic to this period for many years after the war. In Chapter 4, I was looking at the old Bradley School, which was situated at the corner of Bradley Road and Curzon Street, and I covered the history up to the turn of the 20th century. As the school numbers increased, an additional classroom for infants was built in 1908, and in the same year a new entrance and porch was created for the use of the boys. This sufficed for some years, but by the 1940s the amount of school accommodation was again insufficient. Unfortunately, there was little room on the premises to expand. In the early 1950s, the council housing estate had started construction, and the Education Committee envisaged a single-stream primary school to replace the old church school building that had been used for 3/4 of a century. However, the number of primary school pupils had been sadly underestimated, and it was quickly realised that a school twice as large as proposed was required immediately. The new school building was officially opened on 17th of September 1956 at a cost of £100,000. It was still necessary, however, to seek alternative school facilities, albeit temporary, to replace the lack of classroom space. In 1932, the lease of Bradley Lodge had been purchased by the Borough Housing Committee, which possibly had the intention of gaining control of the extensive freehold site for erecting housing, but in 1958 it was still standing and in good repair. Bradley Lodge was appropriated as a school annex. Bradley Lodge was one of the old homesteads of the village and had a long history. There is mention of the lodge as early as 1592, which at that date was one of the 4 settlement sites in the Bradley district. The lodge site may have been the same one that is still shown in 1829 up Bradley Lane and near Hope's House, which comprised of 2 separate farmhouses, one with a shop and some cottages. The actual Victorian Lodge House was built around 1837. Scholars attended the lodge toward the middle of their junior education before returning to the Sherwood Avenue School for their final year. Following the closure of Bradley Lodge as a school, the Huddersfield Education and Youth Department took over the land and demolished the lodge to replace it with a modern youth club premises. The outbuildings and the garages which stood behind the former house remained, utilised by the youth club to run and maintain a number of go-karts here. The tarmac drive made an ideal circuit for the small fast vehicles. As a youngster, I spent many hours in Bradley Lodge climbing trees, riding my bike in the tennis courts and exploring the remains of the once idyllic gardens. But by the 1990s this was swept away to make room for yet more houses. Has a number of old, disused and still operating railway lines in its vicinity. We have mentioned the Leeds to Manchester main line to Huddersfield in chapter 3, but there was the old Midland line whose large viaduct has dominated the skyline for over a century. And on its boundary lies the old Kirkburton line and also the still operating Calder Valley line. And there is also the Bradley branch line, which was disused for many years but resurrected in the late 1990s. The Bradley Wood branch line was opened for goods traffic in 1851. This connected Huddersfield directly with Halifax and carried freight between the two towns up until about 1859. The building of the Bradley Wood branch line involved the construction of a short but deep tunnel of 70 yards length under the two roads, Bradley Lane at its junction with the newly opened Birstall and Huddersfield Turnpike Road, which later became the main A62 Leeds to Huddersfield Road. The Bradley Wood branch line opened to the public in 1860, providing direct passenger service to Halifax. The new through route took just 25 minutes without the inconvenience of changing trains. There was no intermediate stations on the line as it passed through sparsely inhabited countryside. The branch swung off from the main Calder Valley line just 1 mile south-east of the old Brighouse station, then passed beneath a bridge carrying a farm track, before progressing onto a level crossing taking Steep Lane besides Bradley Hall over the line to Bradley Hall Farm. Passing through a attractively wooded area, the line curved beneath Low Quarry Road, carried over the track by a stone bridge, and then plunged into the small tunnel I mentioned above. There was 2 other overline bridges that were encountered near Bradley Church, one named Gibson's Bridge, before the branch made its junction with the Huddersfield to Manchester main line immediately east of the former site of Bradley Station. The Midland Line. The Midland Railway Newton's goods line was a late addition to the rail network, opening on 1st November 1910. It bridged the River Cone on the Ramsden Canal courtesy of a viaduct 255 yards long and 90 feet high, comprising of 15 arches, and this viaduct still dominates the Bradley skyline. The Newton branch was associated with the Midland scheme to create an independent link between Sheffield and Bradford, avoiding the congested lines around Leeds. It reached Dewsbury but was abandoned when the Lancashire and Yorkshire granted running powers over its lines. The route was never a roaring success, and traffic levels dropped further after the LMS created a link to the Newton's goods line from Red Dolls Junction. The section from Murfield crossing Bradley Viaduct saw its last trains on 12th of August 1937. It was very short lived for a striking piece of engineering. The Midland Line today forms part of the Greenway cycle track. Its viaduct must be the most over-engineered cycle track in the country, but for many years it was blocked off at each end with signs saying "Dangerous structure, keep off." Kirkburton line. This was a branch line to Kirkburton, which had stations at Kirkheaton and Lepton, and was opened in 1867. The line deviated from the main railway just beyond Eton, and immediately was faced with a wide valley through which the River Cone flowed, and also contained the Sir John Ramsden Canal. The arch viaduct was built of locally produced bricks, with most of the supplies being transported to the site by barge along the Ramsden Canal. Started in 1865, by early February of the following year, all the piers had been put up, but bad weather had begun to cause delays. Only the first two arches had been completed by this month, for which wooden braces that supported the brickwork while under construction had only been removed just before Christmas. It was at this time disaster struck. At about 2 o'clock of the early hours of Thursday, 15th of February, 1866, two police constables on patrol in the nearby Deaton heard a deafening noise, which way they took to be the sound of a boiler exploding in a mill. Arriving at the scene, they found that the two arches had collapsed and the resulting wreckage had fallen to the valley bottom and the canal. After notifying the authorities, a force of 100 men were quickly mustered by the canal superintendent and undertook to clear away the fallen debris before flooding occurred. Despite this setback, the viaduct was actually completed ahead of schedule in October of 1867. It was planned on a shallow curve which was laid with double tracks, and undoubtedly when finished it must have been an impressive sight to the local inhabitants. Eventually, with the closure of the line in the 1970s, the viaduct fell into disrepair and disuse and remains a monument to a near and now but a distant memory. The Calder Valley Line. The Calder Valley Line was the earliest railway, and the section near Bradley was opened in 1841 and formed part of the first Leeds to Manchester Transpennine Railway. The circuitous route completely missed Huddersfield, which had to do with horse-drawn carriages from the station at Cooper Bridge, which I mentioned in Chapter 2. Calder Valley Line was built as the dawn of the railway age, and you could see in the bridge over the River Calder here the engineering marvel of the double arch compared to the later built iron girder bridge when the line was later widened.